All right, folks. For those of you who are not yet aware, I moved my office from downstairs in the basement to upstairs in one of the bedrooms because of the cold downstairs. It's just brutal at this time of the year. Chicago winters. I think it was like 3 degrees outside yesterday. Or today. In any event, this lecture is sponsored by Nancy and David Sheely for the beloved ones who have yortzites. They have days of commemoration, the commemoration of their passing in this month. And they asked to sponsor these couple of classes. This class is going to be, this class is going to be about primarily a paragraph, 2 paragraphs actually, from the Zohar, which describe what happens as the Sabbath comes in. So I have to give a little bit of background in order to be able to follow what's going on over here. The background is as follows. The Torah, the Bible commands that 6 days you shall work, and on the 7th day you shall rest. Right? In other words, the expression that's actually used is Shabbat vayinafash. Shabbat vayinafash. The word vayinafash is related to the word, it means to rest, but it also is related to the word nefesh. Nefesh being one of the levels of the soul, or in a more generic sense, the soul itself. So part of the whole concept of the Sabbath is not just resting from physical work, it's also restoring spiritual, restoring the spiritual side of things. In other words, that's a day that is essentially focused on the spiritual side of things, the cessation of work. When we say work, what do we mean by my work? It doesn't necessarily mean work that's paid. In other words, work that you do for a living. But what it does mean is that there are 39 categories of what are called labor, 39 malachot, 39 types of activity. These are general types of activity that were used in the building of the tabernacle. So you can imagine the tabernacle was made with wooden beams, upright wooden beams that were covered in gold. So the beams had to be cut, the beams had to be sanded, the gold had to be melted and applied to the beams. They were covered with sort of curtains made out of wool and various other materials that were woven together. So there was weaving, and there was chopping of various sorts in order to get to chop the trees down and so on and so forth in order to make the beams. And so altogether, it turns out that there are 39 categories of work, or as it's known in Hebrew, malacha. 39 categories, and that's the work that is prohibited on the Sabbath, even though you might not be earning a living from any of that work. But for example, just in a modern context, putting on a kettle on the Sabbath, because that's making a source of heat and so on, boiling water, would be forbidden. So what do? You make sure that everything is done beforehand. We have an urn, a big urn, and the urn is boiled before the Sabbath, and then it's put on a special Sabbath mode, and we use it that way. So on and so forth. All food is cooked before the Sabbath. It's kept hot. You can keep it on the stove in a certain ways and so on. But anyway, without getting into all the laws of the Sabbath, that's basically the situation of the cessation of malacha, the cessation of work on the Sabbath. But an equally important aspect of this whole concept of rest is the idea of spiritual rest. In other words, the idea of spiritual restoration, to restore our spirits to become somewhat, at least, if not dominant, at least influential in our lives. And that is essentially what this particular paragraph, or these 2 paragraphs in the Zohar are about. I'm only probably going to do 1 paragraph tonight. 28 degrees in Mexico. I think I'm coming. Yep. Okay. So the restoration of the spiritual. Now, what does it mean to restore the spiritual realm? So it has to do. It's allied with the cessation of physical activity In other words, the work that we mentioned, the malacha, it's allied to that, but it's not only that. In other words, in order to be able to restore the spirit fully and properly, that demands, first of all, that the outgoing work of building the world, because that's what essentially the days of the week are, 6 days you shall do work, and on the 7th day you shall rest. The 6 days you shall do work is in order to build and to better and to improve and to make more orderly the world around us. When that work ceases, then the inner dimension sort of has what's called an aliyah. It has it's elevated. There's a certain state of elevation. Now, this is what the paragraph is going to be talking about, and it mentions it in two. There's sort of two planes that are two parallel planes that are part of the picture. The first plane is the plane of the activity of the Sphira of Malchut. Let me just share a screen and show you. Obviously, everybody knows this anyway, but it's important to point it out over here. That's Malchut, the 7th Sphira. The 7th Sphira from Chesed. There's Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzachot, Yesod, and there's Malchut. Malchut is the 7th day, corresponds to the 7th day. Malchut is also called the bride, which is one of the reasons why one of the famous poems or songs of the Sabbath is called L'cha Dodi. Let us go and greet the bride. In fact, if anyone wants to go and have a look, I have an explanation of that song, L'cha Dodi, Lechadodi, 2 words, L'cha Dodi. If you want to go and have a look on the website, KabbalahOnline.org, I think you can find it on Chambad.org as well, the explanation from the Kabbalists of this song, L'cha Dodi. It was actually written by a Kabbalist. It was written by one of the Kabbalists, and his name was Shlomo Elkabitz, and he wrote this song, and it's become part of the Sabbath liturgy to go out and greet the bride. In any event, Malchut is the bride. Who's the bridegroom? The bridegroom is called the rest of the Sfirot of the 6 Sfirot here, which are called the Sfirot of Zer Anpin. Zer Anpin literally means the small face or small visage. The larger visages are Chochmah, Bina, Da'at, Chochmah and Bina. Those are the larger visages. And even there's a concept of visage in Keter as well. But in any event, the small visage, it's called the smaller visage, is Zer Anpin. That's these 6 Sfirot. These correspond to the 6 days of work. Malchut corresponds to the 7th day, to the Sabbath. So Malchut is, in that sense, a feminine day. It's the day of receptivity rather than the day of activity. Activity is the 6 days of work. That's the 6 upper Sfirot of Zer Anpin. And Malchut is the Sphira of not passivity, but receptivity, to be receptive. To be receptive, one can't be in an outgoing mode. You have to be in an absorbent mode. And that's what Malchut is all about on the Sabbath. It's the concept of absorbing what comes from above and then being elevated thereby. Okay, so unfortunately, I did not find a good translation of this Kegavna online, this prayer that we're going to read the first paragraph of, but I'll just translate it in English. It goes like this: Kegavna, just like the 6 Sfirot of Zer Anpin. I should actually, let me go back to that screen so that I can point it out to you. Okay. There we go. Just like the 6 Sfirot of Zer Anpin, in other words, the 6 Sfirot from Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzachot, and Yesod, just like they, Mityachadin La'ela, they unite up above. They are united up above into oneness. They are one. They are regarded as one entity. Just like, for example, a person's face, his partsuf, his face, his visage, or her visage. It comprises various different parts. There's the right eye, the left eye, the right ear, the left ear, the right nostril, left nostril, the mouth, and so on and so forth. Also corresponding, interestingly enough, to, without the mouth, corresponding to the same 6 days of creation. The 2 ears, the 2 eyes, the 2 nostrils are the 6. And then the mouth corresponds to the Sabbath, right? The mouth corresponds, Malchut Peh. Malchut is always called the mouth. Torah Shabbat Peh Karinana, the oral Torah. Malchut represents the oral tradition, the oral handing down of the Torah orally from master to student, all the way from Moses down to our generations. In any event, so the just as they, the 6 Firot of Zera and Pin, unite above into oneness, they are one thing, even though they are, each has its particular function. Chesed has its function, Gvura has its function, Tiferet its function, and so on. But nevertheless, they unite into one. They're one thing. They're one patsuf. They're one visage, right? Just like a person isn't called by his right ear or his left nose, his left nostril. He's called just, this is the face of the person. Just hang on a second here. Sorry. All right. Okay, so just as they are united above in oneness, so she too, Avhi, that's the Avhachi Ihi, so she too, Malchut, unites below into the mystery of oneness. Now, what is the united below into the mystery of oneness? What do we mean by that? So, the initial the initial idea is that the first unification, once there's a cessation of work, in other words, once the Sabbath has come in and there's a cessation of work, people are not outgoing, they've moved into the absorptive mode, so to speak. Again, not the passive mode, but the receptive, absorptive mode, so to speak. So she rises up into the mystery of oneness. In other words, what happens is that that Malchut ascends to a higher level. Malchut ascends to unify with the Zer Anpin. Now, why is this important and what are we talking about over here? So we have to go back a couple of steps and we have to explain something that began right at the beginning of the creation. As I've spoken about on several occasions, a number of occasions, and probably everybody knows about it already, but in any event, in the beginning of creation, one of the first events that happened was that V'ruach Elokim merachefet al pnei hamayim, the Spirit of God hovered over the waters, so to speak. In other words, hovered over the unformed, as yet unformed void that we spoke about actually last night in last night's class. We spoke about the concept of tohu. So the idea was that the Spirit of God hovered over the waters, merachefet, and the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzhak Luria, the famous Kabbalist from Safed in the 1600s, the 16th century rather, explains that Rapach mate, the seven kings of the world of Tohu, the world of chaos, 7 kings of the world of chaos, broke apart, they fell apart, shattered, and caused 288 sparks of holiness, of very high level of holiness, to descend into the physical creation. Part of our doing work during the week is what is called birur hanitzutzot, elevating or disencumbering is sometimes the term used. Disencumbering, in other words, removing them from their encumberment and removing them from their sort of imprisonment, unimprisoning, if you could say such a thing, freeing, elevating, and elevating the sparks that have subdivided and subdivided and subdivided and subdivided into the rest of creation. Originally, there were 288 original sparks. Those are subdivided so that there's a spark of tohu, of the world of the shattered vessels, of the world of tohu in all of physical creation. What we are doing during the 6 days of work is that we are elevating those sparks we're disencumbering them, we're removing them from their shell, so to speak, in order that they can be elevated on the Sabbath. How are they elevated on the Sabbath? When they come together with Malchut, because the ultimate completion of the work is on the seventh day. The work is complete on the seventh day, and therefore when Malchut ascends to a yichud meaning a unification with Zer Anpin, then all of these sparks ascend, and they ascend to the higher level of Zer Anpin. Whether they stay there or not depends on our actions, our activities, but generally this is a very slow and drawn out, long process of elevation. It doesn't happen. Sometimes through certain actions can happen in almost instantaneously, that a spark reaches its zenith, but generally it's a much slower process and a slow, how can we call it, ascending circle of virtue, I suppose you could put it that way, a slowly ascending circle of virtue. So in other words, the way the Torah sees things, the way Kabbalah in particular sees things, is that we're moving towards a higher goal all of the time. Yes, sometimes there's some backtracking, and sometimes there's perhaps a fall from a certain level of spirituality, but slowly, all in all, we're moving in the right direction. The universe is, so to speak, moving in the right direction towards this unification up above. But that it doesn't stop there. So let's just continue now. It says like this. Avhachi, she too, that's Malchut, is Yachades Lasata Baraza de Echad. She's united below in the secret of oneness. What does it mean she's united below? She's united with all those sparks that have been elevated to Malchut during the 6 days of work. Lemeheve imhon, in order to be with them, la'ela, up above, chad, to be one with them up above. In other words, to be one with Zer Anpin up above, lekavel chad, to parallel the unity of Zer Anpin. The unity of Zer Anpin is brought about by the influence of the higher sfirot that unify Zer Anpin. So too, when Malchut ascends, it takes it unites with Zer Anpin, and also becomes enveloped in that same unity, or at least in a similar unity. That unity of Zer Anpin and Malchut is in fact the goal of human endeavor. The higher unity of Chokhmah and Bina, which is called Abba and Ima, which we spoke about yesterday, mother and father, father and mother, that's a higher unity, and that'll happen in the future. But in the meanwhile, what we're doing is, in the natural world, in the world of the 6 days of work and the 1 day of rest, what we're doing is we're starting to elevate the sparks all back up above and restore them to a state of unity. Initially, they restored to the original 288 sparks, but those 288 sparks were already the shattered vessels. We intend to restore the vessels and rectify them. That's the concept of tikkun rectification. The whole world of tikkun, the world that we live in, the world now is called the world of tikkun, is to rectify the world of tohu. And the way that's done is by expressing this unity, by this elevation of soul, in order to achieve a feeling of unity of the soul with what is up above. So therefore, we continue, and it says like this, Kucha Brichu Echad. God, the Almighty, the Holy One, blessed be He, is one who is one above. He is one above, does not take his seat. He does not take his throne, so to speak. In other words, he does not proclaim himself king, so to speak. Dikare, his glorious throne. And Avidas Ihi Berazadechad, until Malchut achieves the level of oneness, she enters into the mystery of oneness. Until Malchut, in other words, until human activity, until all the things that we've done during the week, all the positive things that we've done during the week are raised up into a state of unity, or raised up into a higher spiritual state, so to speak, the Almighty, the Holy One, blessed be He, does not take His throne. In other words, He doesn't sit as, so to speak, this is all imagery, obviously. He doesn't sit as king on His throne until Malchut is in a state of unity, similar to His oneness, corresponding to His oneness. Kegavna dilelem eva echad be'echad, to be one in one, so to speak, the oneness of Malchut together with Zera and Pin. So that is essentially the goal. And then the passage continues and says like this: this, as we have stated, Baha Ukimna, we have stated, we have set it up, we've explained it. Raza da Hashem echad u'shma echad. This is the secret of God is one and His name is one. Now, this is a subject that needs to be really explained at great lengths. Perhaps in a future class, I will go into it at greater lengths. But the concept of name is extremely important in Kabbalah. Each one of the Sfirot is associated with a divine name. But the light of the Sfirot is all associated with one name, with the name, with the transcendental, the transcendent name, the name Havaya, Yud Ke Vav Ke, Yud He Vav He, the ineffable name that we don't actually pronounce as it is written. We don't pronounce it as it is written because it is not in a stage of being revealed yet. In the future we will. But in any event, the idea is that God is one and His name is one, meaning as follows. What is the concept of name? Name is the activities, divine activities are carried out, so to speak, through the divine names. Each name has a particular meaning. For example, the name associated with the Sphira of Chesed, the name associated with the Sphira of Chesed is the name Kel, Aleph Lamed, which means power, but it doesn't mean power in a negative sense. It doesn't mean might in the sense of might. It means power in the sense of extending outwards, projecting outwards, imbuing everything with its own power. That's the concept of Kel. The idea of kindness is to imbue other things with divine power. That's the concept of Chesed. Whereas the opposite, the name Elokim, is associated with Gvura. The name Elokim, the gematria, the numerical value of the name Elokim, Aleph Lamed He Yud Mem, the numerical value is 86, which corresponds to, equals the same word as nature, Hateva. Yes, 86, Hateva, so that's nature. So in other words, Chesed is beaming out light and energy. Gvura is now constricting it so that the energy doesn't go into places that it shouldn't go, and that it'll be earned and not simply wasted. And so it goes with each of the Sfirot. Each one has a name that is associated with it. Now, the name of a king, for example, when you address a king, you wouldn't call him whatever his name was. Let's say, I don't know, King Henry or whatever. You know, you wouldn't call him Henry or King Charles or even Queen Elizabeth. When you address them personally, you call them His Majesty or Her Majesty, right? You don't call them by their name. And why do you not call them by their name? Because it's a concept of disrespect. The name Her Majesty or His Majesty represents a certain power. There's actually a story that an interesting story that I'll tell you. This was at the time. This story is about Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who was the first Rebbe, the first Hasidic leader of the Chabad or Lubavitch movement. He was the inspiration behind it. He was the third generation from the Baal Shem Tov, and his main disciple is the Magid Mezrich. And one of the main disciples, if not the main disciple of the Magid Mezrich, was Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. He was one of the main disciples, and in many ways, he was regarded by the Magid Mezrich himself Rabbi Dovber, as his chief disciple. In any event, be that as it may, I'm not going to argue the point with anyone who wants to discuss it otherwise or sees it otherwise. But there's an interesting story that happened with him. He bore the brunt. As you probably know, the Hasidic movement began to flourish after the time of Shabtai Tzvi. Who was Shabtai Tzvi? Shabtai Tzvi was a very charismatic person, but a false messiah. He sort of proclaimed himself the messiah, and then he was actually in the eastern countries of the Eastern Arabic countries, east of Israel, and when they got hold of him and threatened him that if he didn't convert to Islam, he would be put to death, and he did. He unfortunately did convert to Islam, and he wasn't put to death by the Arab leaders, but he was certainly regarded as dead by Jewish leaders, by Jews, in the sense that although he wasn't actually dead, he was no longer regarded in any way as someone who we would, I suppose you could say, someone who we would regard as of any importance whatsoever. In fact, completely the opposite. And was a very unfortunate incident, but because of the whole incident with Shabtai Tzvi, subsequently in the time of the Baal Shem Tov, and in the two generations following the Baal Shem Tov in particular, there was a tremendous amount of opposition to the Baal Shem Tov because they were worried that the Baal Shem Tov, God forbid, was the same kind of influence as Shabtai Tzvi. And of course it wasn't, but this was the worry. So there was a tremendous opposition that grew to the Hasidic movement, and most of that opposition fell on the third generation of leaders, and the generation, the leader, the elder leader of the Hasidic movement after the passing of the Maggid of Mezrich was someone named Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk. He moved with all his disciples. He moved to Israel, and that way he escaped a lot of the vitriol from the opposition to Hasidism. So the vitriol then fell on Rabbi Shneur Zalman. Now, it so happened that he was pursued, he was jailed, he was pardoned, and eventually people came to realize that he was not what they thought he was. Anyway, the story with him goes like this. There were two people who were of the opposition, belonged to the Mitnagdim, it's called, the Misnagdim, the opposition to Hasidism. And they were asked they were accused of doing something that they shouldn't have done. Whether the accusation was correct or it was incorrect, but the accusation was very serious, and they didn't see any way out. They tried whichever way they could to lessen the accusation or to nullify it, but it didn't. Nothing worked. Eventually, they felt that they needed sort of a miracle, and one of their compatriots, one of their friends, suggested, "Well, why don't you go to Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi? Maybe he can help you." I said, "What? Him? He's the leader of the opposition." So I said, "Look, I'm telling you that he's a miracle worker and he can help you. If you want to go to him, go. If you don't want to go, don't go. That's completely up to you. You do what you want." Anyway, they decided eventually that they would go and visit him and ask his advice what to do in this particular situation. So they went to him and they told him the situation. They asked for his advice, and he said to them the following, which is related to this, how it relates to what we were talking about before. He said, "What does it mean? how do you address a king?" So they said to him, "Call him Your Majesty." So I said, "Why don't you call him by his name?" Because that's improper to call a king by his name. You call him His Majesty or Her Majesty, whatever the king or the queen is. That's how you address them. And He said this in response to a question which he asked them. The question that he asked them was as follows: what does it mean that the higher world is like the lower world? Like we just explained, the higher world is like the lower world. And he said, just as a king in the higher world is he himself, he has his name, but in the lower world he's called Your Majesty, or in the case of a queen, Her Majesty. We don't address them directly. That's what it means, that the lower world is like the higher world, but the higher world remains the higher world. So they were completely mystified as to what this all was all about. They thought they were just being sort of given a quiz to see if they were smart or they knew some or whatever, and they left sort of in a huff. Anyway, they decided that what they would do is they would go and appeal to the minister that was in charge of the prisons and the courts and so on and so forth. So they found out that he would go and walk in there were certain public gardens that he would go and take a walk in at lunchtime every day. So they decided they would go and beseech him and perhaps bribe him or whatever they could do. In those days, that was just like modern politicians. I think also bribery worked pretty well. I'm not accusing anyone in particular, but campaign contributions, they call them, and so on and so forth. In any event, they decided they were going to go bribe this minister, or at least talk to him and try and get some clemency that way. So they saw a very distinguished person walking to the garden, and they immediately went up to him, and they said to him, Your Honor, the minister, and said, this is our case, and so on. He said, wait. You want the Minister of Justice? That's not me, right? I'm the Minister of Education, but I see that you're learned people, you're learned Jews. Perhaps you could answer me the following question. The Tsar asked me this question. He said, what does it mean when it says in the Talmud that the higher world is like the lower world, right? That the higher world is like the lower world. And so they looked at each other and they realized that they just had the answer from Rabbi Shneur Zalman Liadi, who told them a day or two before exactly what the answer was. And they said, well, it means that the king is not addressed by his name, he's addressed by as Your Majesty or Her Majesty, etc. And he was very pleased with the answer. He said he's going to go to the Tsar himself and tell him an explanation, and he will ask the Tsar himself for clemency for them, and that's what happened in any event. So, to cut a very long story short, that is the idea of the higher world being like the lower world, except what? The higher world on the Sabbath merges, the lower world on the Sabbath merges into and becomes part of the higher world. That's called the Yichud, the unification of Zeir Anpin and Malchut, the unification of the bride, the groom and the bride, the unification of the groom and the bride. What's the unification of the groom and the bride? The groom is Zeir Anpin, the bride is Malchut, as we explained before. That unification is there to produce the next generation, so to speak, to produce to provide a home for the divine presence, because that's what marriage is all about, and that's what the unification is all about. Unification of Zeir Anpin and Malchut, and that is what the cessation of work is about. It's making a spiritual home for the divine presence. And that's what starts off on the Sabbath. There is another paragraph, but I think we will do that next week, which goes on to speak more about the secret of the Sabbath, the mystery of the Sabbath, and we'll look at that next week. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer. What's the practical difference of filling Malchut, which we've talked about in the past, here and elevating Malchut? Yeah, the practical difference is this. When we're talking about the manifestation of Malchut, or what you refer to as filling Malchut, that is an outgoing activity. That's the activity of Malchut. Here we're talking about the receptivity of Malchut. To be receptive, in other words, what is a home? A home that's completely crowded, doesn't have any room for anyone to live in, right? This is a decluttered home. It's a home that we build on the Sabbath for the infusion of spiritual influence from above. And that is the idea of the elevation of Malchut into a spiritual mode into a mode of receptivity rather than in a mode of activity. Hope that answers it for you. Any other questions, folks? All right, there don't seem to be. If anyone does have any other question, so on Shabbat, the low world and high world unite. Does this mean that Anpin is united with Malchut? Yes. Zer Anpin is united with Malchut. That's what happens. Yes. Zer Anpin is united with Malchut. You are very welcome, Miriam. Zer Anpin is united with Malchut, and Malchut is united with Zer Anpin. It's the bride and the groom together. And what's the favorite way to welcome the bride? Well, what's called Kabbalat Shabbat, the service, it's a short service on Friday and Friday evening. Usually in my synagogue, there's a short period of dancing at the time of L'cha Dodi, at the end of L'cha, that hymn that I mentioned, that we welcome the bride. So everyone dances around the bima, the central reading table of the synagogue, and then come home for kiddush. Kiddush is the sanctification of the Sabbath over a cup of wine, and then eating the meal together. So the favorite part of Sabbath is being home, being with your family, being with your. In my case, most of my kids are grown up already. All of them actually are grown up already. All are no longer living with us. They have their own families, and so myself and my wife. And when our kids are, then we all celebrate together. Yes, that is correct, Ben. The bride is Malchut and the groom is Zer Anpin. That is correct. Right. Thank you very much, Hillel. I'm not in Florida, no. I'm actually in Chicago right now. My wife could not go to Florida now. There was whatever. Sorry, you're freezing. Yeah, actually, I'm warm where I am now, up in the one of the rooms upstairs. As you can see, it's a bedroom, but nevertheless, it's pretty warm. Yes, these winters are. Eventually, one day, I think we're going to all move to Florida. Okay. All right, folks. We'll call it a day. I'll stop recording.